In this episode, we're going to connect threat intelligence thinking to the idea of forensic artifacts, but we're going to do it in a way that stays beginner-friendly and purpose-driven rather than technical and tool-heavy. Forensic artifacts can sound like something only specialists handle, and beginners sometimes assume the topic is about running complicated software and extracting hidden files. The truth is that an artifact is simply a piece of evidence left behind by activity, and the intelligence skill is knowing which evidence is worth seeking given a specific hypothesis. A hypothesis in this context is a defensible guess about what might be happening, such as credential misuse, malware execution, unauthorized persistence, or data staging. When you pull artifacts that actually advance the hypothesis, you reduce uncertainty quickly and you avoid the busy work of collecting evidence that looks impressive but does not answer the question. The exam mindset here is not about memorizing every artifact type, but about demonstrating that you can choose evidence strategically, interpret it responsibly, and connect it back to a decision. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good way to start is to define a forensic artifact as something that can help you reconstruct activity over time, especially activity that might not be obvious from a single log source. Artifacts can come from many places, such as system event records, authentication history, application traces, file system changes, process execution history, network connection records, and traces of user interaction. The important beginner insight is that you rarely need every artifact because evidence collection is constrained by time, access, and relevance. In intelligence work, you are always balancing effort against value, and the value of an artifact is measured by how much it increases or decreases your confidence in a hypothesis. If an artifact will not change your assessment, it may be interesting but not necessary for the current question. This is the same discipline you used when selecting sources and filtering logs, just applied to forensic evidence. When you keep that discipline, artifacts become a practical tool for clarity rather than a rabbit hole. Hypothesis-driven artifact selection begins with writing the hypothesis in plain language, because vague hypotheses produce vague collection. A useful hypothesis has a subject, a behavior, and a reason you suspect it, such as a privileged account was used in an unusual way to access sensitive systems, or a workstation executed an unauthorized program and then began unusual outbound communication. If your hypothesis is too broad, like the system is compromised, you will not know what evidence would confirm or refute it. A good hypothesis also has competing alternatives, because many suspicious patterns have benign explanations, such as a user traveling, a system update, or a new business integration. When you acknowledge alternatives, you can choose artifacts that distinguish between them. That is the heart of advancing a hypothesis. You are not collecting evidence to prove yourself right. You are collecting evidence to decide which explanation fits best. This approach is calm and disciplined, and it is exactly what intelligent investigation requires. Once the hypothesis is clear, you choose artifacts by asking what decision point you are trying to reach next, because investigations often move through stages. Early on, you might be trying to decide whether an event is likely benign or likely malicious, and later you might be trying to decide scope, impact, and containment priority. Different stages call for different artifacts, and beginners sometimes skip ahead, hunting for deep details before they have established that the situation is real. For example, if you are not yet sure whether a suspicious login is unauthorized, you might prioritize authentication artifacts, session history, and related access patterns rather than jumping straight into detailed file system analysis. If you are confident unauthorized access occurred, you might then prioritize artifacts that reveal what was done after access, such as process execution traces, new persistence indicators, or data access history. The concept is to collect what answers the next question, not what satisfies curiosity. This is how you keep the work efficient and decision-focused. A common beginner misconception is that the best artifact is always the most technical artifact, but often the most useful artifacts are the ones that establish sequence and identity. Sequence tells you what happened first, what happened next, and what changed, which is crucial for understanding cause and effect. Identity tells you who or what performed the actions, which helps you avoid misattribution and helps you determine scope. Artifacts that support sequence include time-stamped event records and execution histories that show when activities occurred. Artifacts that support identity include account usage records, session tokens, device identifiers, and context that links an action to a specific host or user. Without sequence, you can mistake coincidence for causality, and without identity, you can chase the wrong actor or miss related activity. Even as a beginner, you can prioritize sequence and identity artifacts because they support almost every investigative hypothesis. When those foundations are solid, more specialized artifacts become easier to interpret. Another key idea is that artifacts are rarely definitive in isolation because attackers can mimic normal activity, and normal activity can look suspicious. This is why you should think in terms of corroboration and consistency across different evidence types. For example, if your hypothesis is credential misuse, you might look for artifacts that show unusual authentication patterns, unusual access to resources, and possibly unusual session behavior that does not fit the user's normal profile. If your hypothesis is malware execution, you might look for artifacts that show an unexpected program running, changes to system behavior afterward, and network patterns that suggest external communication. Each artifact adds a piece to the story, and the story becomes stronger when pieces align. If artifacts conflict, that is not a failure. It is a signal that you need to adjust your hypothesis or consider alternative explanations. Intelligence maturity is the ability to let evidence change your mind. Artifacts can also be volatile or durable, and understanding that difference helps you decide what to prioritize first when time is limited. Volatile artifacts are those that can disappear quickly, like certain memory-resident traces, temporary files, or short-lived connection states. Durable artifacts are those that persist longer, like many event logs, file metadata, or configuration changes, depending on retention. You do not need to perform memory collection to grasp the concept. You just need to understand that some evidence evaporates if you wait too long, while other evidence can be reviewed later. In a time-sensitive situation, you prioritize volatile evidence because once it is gone, you cannot recover it. This is a decision-making principle that applies broadly. Protect the evidence that is most likely to disappear and most likely to answer the hypothesis. The exam can test this logic by asking what to do first when investigating a suspected event. A calm, evidence preservation mindset is often the best answer. When you pull artifacts, you also need to preserve meaning, which means you must maintain context about where the artifact came from, how it was obtained, and what limitations exist. An artifact without context can be misinterpreted, especially if you do not know the system's role, the user's normal behavior, or the environment's logging configuration. Context can also include whether the artifact is complete, whether time synchronization is reliable, and whether the artifact could be influenced by legitimate system processes. In intelligence terms, this is about confidence and defensibility, because you want to be able to explain why an artifact supports your assessment. This also helps you communicate to stakeholders, because a decision maker may not care about the raw artifact, but they will care about whether the conclusion is supported by trustworthy evidence. Preserving context is how you keep your intelligence honest and resistant to challenge. It also reduces rework, because you do not have to constantly revisit how you got the evidence. Another practical skill is distinguishing artifacts that indicate presence from artifacts that indicate impact, because investigations can drift if you do not separate those goals. Presence artifacts help you decide whether unauthorized activity likely occurred, and they often include authentication anomalies, unusual execution, or suspicious network patterns. Impact artifacts help you decide what was affected, such as what data was accessed, what systems were modified, or what persistence mechanisms were established. Beginners sometimes jump to impact questions before they have confirmed presence, which leads to wasted effort and alarming conclusions built on weak foundations. A disciplined approach confirms presence to a reasonable confidence level, then expands towards scope and impact. This staged approach also supports better prioritization, because you can decide when to escalate response efforts based on evidence strength. Intelligence is not just finding facts. It is sequencing your search, so each step makes the next step more efficient. It also helps to remember that artifacts can support not only incident investigations, but also broader intelligence goals like understanding adversary behavior patterns over time. When you repeatedly see similar artifacts across different events, you can build a picture of recurring techniques and common pathways, which can inform operational readiness. For example, you might notice that certain access patterns or persistence behaviors appear in multiple cases, suggesting a stable method used by an adversary type. This does not require naming an actor. It requires recognizing a pattern that matters. Over time, those patterns can guide what telemetry you prioritize, what controls you strengthen, and what training you provide. This is where forensic thinking connects back to intelligence production, because artifacts become evidence that feeds assessments. The key is to remain disciplined about confidence, because patterns are powerful but can be misleading if evidence is thin or biased by collection gaps. To close, pulling forensic artifacts that advance your hypothesis is about strategic evidence selection, not about collecting everything that exists. You start by writing a clear hypothesis and acknowledging alternatives. Then you choose artifacts that answer the next decision point and that increase or decrease confidence efficiently. You prioritize sequence and identity because they support almost every investigation. You seek corroboration across evidence types, and you respect the difference between volatile and durable artifacts when time matters. You preserve context so conclusions remain defensible, and you separate presence questions from impact questions so you do not drift into busy work. When you practice this approach, forensic artifacts stop feeling like a specialist-only topic and start feeling like practical evidence that supports calm reasoning. That calm, hypothesis-driven discipline is exactly what turns messy situations into decision-ready intelligence, and it is the kind of thinking the exam is designed to reward.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.